Greetings, members, one and all of the Salivation Nation. How silver could outperform gold in 2022. Let's explore. We've been pretty frustrated with both gold, but especially silver in 2021. There's a lot of questions surrounding silver's performance especially, but gold, especially in an era of high inflation that's well established and recognized as not being transitory, it seems like by now we should see prices rise. I'm going to be referencing an article here from Kitco News, authored by Anna Golubova, and I think this is a great piece that really talks about how silver could outperform gold. There are several assumptions made in this article, and we don't know exactly what's going to happen next year. Many of us thought, at least by the end of this year, we would see higher prices for especially silver, but gold as well. There's a coming bull market, according to this article here, that's coming next year, and we'll see what happens for sure, but very interesting indeed. I do like to cover topics related to the markets and precious metals, so I hope you enjoy videos like this. If you do, please press that thumbs up button. It's most helpful to get the word out and to help the algorithm. Let's get into what Anna is talking about in this particular piece. Gold and silver had an uneventful year in 2021. Silver is down about 13.5% year to date, and gold is down 4.8%. Silver really had no life of its own this year, fluctuating merely in gold's slipstream. On balance, it suffered disproportionately high losses as compared to gold. As a result, the gold-to-silver ratio has climbed from a good 70, which is now kind of the new normal, or what would be considered normal, to now over 80. I remember the days when 60 or high 50s was considered the normal between the gold-to-silver prices. For the next year, analysts are not discouraged, noting that the bearish sentiment around precious metals is on the cusp of shifting, with the technical charts looking healthy and silver trading cheaply compared to gold. Silver is a hybrid. It's a precious metal with a role as an inflation hedge, but it's also an industrial metal that has a lot of different applications. In fact, that is really where we should be focused in 2022, with silver as an industrial metal. Not only in terms of its wide range of uses in industry, but also in technology, biomedical science, and the like. And this is from NDR, Ned Davis Research. Chief Global Investment Strategist Tim Hayes says, we'll see that maintained. Silver made a multi-year low in 2020, around March of that year, and as much as it's been weak recently, it's still above the 2014 and 2019 lows, and it's making higher lows. That's something that's very important to consider here, folks. As awful as silver's performed this year with what has happened this year and last year, it is abundantly clear that silver's has higher lows than before. Now, the range between 2014 and 2019, has it exceeded inflation? I think it's come fairly close. And I think when you take into account what you could sell your silver for, I would say the answer to that is yes. And it might be a video that may require further study on a different topic, but I think that if you bought silver in 2014 through 2019 at near the lows or at the lows, and you held on to it to today, and what you could sell it for, which is likely going to be above spot, even for some generic, you're doing well, and you preserved your wealth during that course of time. It is also not unusual for silver to get dragged around by gold, said Perth Mint manager of listed products and investment research Jordan Alicio. Silver prices collapsed in the first quarter of 2020. I remember that very well. Many of you do too. We saw effectively a once-in-a-century event where the gold to silver ratio went over 110. In fact, it took about 126 of these in order to buy one of these, at least on paper. That was the ratio, about 126 to 1. That's crazy stuff right there. Pretty amazing to see and witness the gold to silver ratio climb so high during that massive dip. But that really was only on paper, that gold to silver ratio fall or increase. Following a correction in 2021, the technical outlook looks promising for silver as investors see it as a bargain buy relative to gold. But again, that is only in the electronic markets and the ETFs on paper. The gold to silver ratio is now a lot healthier. It's basically at 80 to 1. It's nowhere near the extreme that we saw in March 2020. Anytime the ratio has been 80 to 1, silver began to look relatively cheap, Alizio said. If you go all the way back to the middle of the 70s, there's only been a couple of times where silver has been cheaper relative to gold than the roughly 80 to 1 ratio. But there's multiple reasons for that. You've heard me talk about that ad nauseum through the course of the last couple of years on this channel as to why the ratio is so high. A lot of that has to do with the duality of the metal, and it's seen more than half of it is seen as a commodity rather than as a hedge. So what are the key macro drivers for 2022? According to this article, it'll be up to several drivers to trigger this rally in 2022, and silver is paying close attention to the inflation hedge narrative and the industrial outlook. Analysts said investors would need to see a reversal of some of the main headwinds holding gold and silver back this year, including the U.S. dollar, real yields, strong economic growth, and the idea that inflation is transitory. Many thought 2021 would have been the year of silver and gold because of the hot inflation fears. Price pressures reached the highest level since 1982 in the U.S. in November, with the annual CPI rising to 6.8%. But the picture is a lot more complicated, with the inflation driver likely to kick in only next year. We've seen more money pour into equity strategies this year than pretty much the last 20 years combined. That's held gold and silver back. The U.S. dollar index is up around 8% this year, and that is a natural headwind. Real yields rose this year, economic growth beat expectations, and the market was convinced that inflation was transitory only until 2 months ago, said Alizio. And you keep in mind, there's also the cryptocurrency factor as well, too. We've talked about that. We also talked about supply chain issues actually working negatively, especially for silver, because if you can't have chips and there's a chip shortage, you can't use silver and to some extent even gold in order to make those chips and other materials in order to make products to be utilized. If the supply chains are mucked up, no need to supply things that you can't get out, and that's kind of what has worked against silver, I think, this year. Even now, the market is expecting inflation to return closer to 3% within the next 5 months. The market is currently pricing a fairly aggressive Fed taper, 3 rate hikes in 2022, and inflation closer to 2.5% rather than 6.5% in 5 years from now, Alizio explained. Now, that's the market. That's kind of what, in a sense, the Federal Reserve, especially what Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell said recently, that he didn't use the word transitory, but essentially he's effectively saying that inflation is transitory. It's going to scale back. In other words, it's not going to be nearly as bad. 3% or a target of 2.5%, which is what they had relegated themselves to being fine with before this inflation stuff got out of control or got out of their control. That is still bad in my view, but nonetheless, we'll see if it gets there. I have a feeling it won't. I think we're going to continue with the inflation. But what do I know? That's just a guess on my part. Gold has a history of performing well once the Fed commences a rate hike cycle, and silver follows gold. And that is something that I've talked about on this channel. Different minds think different things about this particular point. Some feel that the Fed's raising rate hikes are actually going to do good for the dollar, and we're going to see silver fall and gold fall because of it. And that could happen for the first, maybe even the second, but I think by the third, I agree with this commentary that it's going to cause gold and silver to go up. It wouldn't surprise me to see gold bottom and start to move higher once the Fed completes its taper faster than expected and moves to raise rates, Eliseo noted. So we may see that gold could actually fall briefly during that time. Given how equity markets are priced, the next decade might not be as lucrative for the traditional 60-40 portfolio allocation. It's almost inconceivable that those strategies will continue to return what they have been over the last 10 years. Even investment managers that run strategies like that are out there telling their clients that the next decade is probably not going to be so rewarding for mainstream financial assets. Alternative assets are kind of where things are going these days, and alternative assets would not be considered silver and gold, but cryptocurrencies and things like that. So after a year of underperformance, investors could turn their attention back to silver next year. There's certainly that catch-up story built in there. It has underperformed gold as of late, and you'll find some switching by investors into the silver market as consequences of that, said ANC senior commodity strategist Daniel Hines. The gold-to-silver ratio also points to silver's potential outperformance, noted Eliseo. The very fact that the gold-silver ratio is at roughly 80-1, that alone suggests that if gold is going to rise, silver at the very least is going to come along for the ride and could quite likely outperform gold. Silver also benefits if commodities as a whole do well, although it didn't do that this year, especially when copper rose up dramatically. If economies perform relatively strongly, it should benefit from an industrial perspective and the whole ESG transition that's taking place in the economy. Right now, silver is on sale because the gold-silver ratio trades near 80-1, said Euro-Pacific Capital Chief Economist and Global Strategist Peter Schiff. To put that into perspective, the average in the modern era has been between 40 to 50-1. In simple terms, historically, silver is extremely underperformed compared to gold. At some point, you should expect that gap to close, Schiff wrote. With that spread widening again, we could see settling up for another big rally in silver. Now, I will say on top of that, it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to happen. Again, we could have new normals for this type of thing with what the gold to silver ratio has been doing. Just because something should be somewhere else does not necessarily mean it will go somewhere else. So keep that in mind as well too. But one thing is notable, I certainly have seen it, you have seen it, when gold goes up and climbs, silver tends to climb up faster. So that is something that is interesting to note. Silver does tend to outperform when it rides the coattails of gold. But of course, conversely, when gold goes down consistently, silver tends to fall even more, hence the widening. Silver's price action suffered in 2021, partially because of supply bottlenecks and significantly increased energy costs. But the industrial component in silver is also will contribute to the precious metals rally next year as some of the supply chain issues get resolved. And I do think they probably will get resolved. I think we have reached a new point in how to deal with the pandemic. Things will more likely get back to a greater sense of normalcy. Not totally normal, but a greater sense of normalcy. The industrial component of the silver market will tend to benefit more against the macro backdrop, which is still resulting in above-trend growth on a global basis. Even though that's easing back from some of the growth rates we saw this year, but certainly it's still a positive economic story, said Hines. Silver can hold up relatively well off the back of industrial component as opposed to gold over the next 12 months. Demand consumption from the renewable sector will start to pick up as well. And by the way, I think that will happen in spite of whether or not the Build Back Better plan passes or anything related to the Green New Deal. Private industry is leaning more towards that and has been for years. And we're going to see probably more demand in that area. provided that the supply chain issues get worked out and get resolved sooner rather than later. The Silver Institute is projecting a supply deficit for the silver market in 2022, citing more industrial demand and global decarbonization efforts, and I've talked about that in a prior video as well. This is attributable to a strong industrial demand, which is benefiting from structural factors in addition to the continued post-corona recovery. These include the electrification of the vehicle fleet, 5G technology, and the commitment of governments to invest in green infrastructure. According to Commerce Bank analyst Karsten Fritz, significantly more silver is used in electric vehicles than in cars with internal combustion engines. By the way, copper is also even more significantly used in that regard. The shift more towards solar energy is another critical driver that could take silver prices higher, according to a Bank of America commodity strategist. The silver market is rebalanced on production discipline and demand from new applications, including solar panels. Increased investment into solar panels should boost silver, and that's something that pretty much we all agree that's going to continue to climb. So the forecast could vary next year according to what these analysts say, and they're saying anywhere between $24 and $30 an ounce next year, depending on the outlook. And I think that's a pretty fair and safe range to make a prediction. I will give my prediction later next year. We'll see what happens. My track record is not good for this year, at least so far. The year's not over yet, but we're getting close. Commerce Bank analyst Kirsten Friend sees silver reaching $26 an ounce in 2022. The silver price should benefit from this positive demand outlook and rise to $26 an ounce next year. Silver would thus also make up some ground against gold. This is not unusual, as silver normally follows gold price movements disproportionately. This year it happened downwards. Next year it should happen upwards on an average. ANZ's Hines is more bullish on silver than gold, but still sees the precious metal ending the year at just $22 an ounce after peaking at $24 mid-2022. So that's interesting. So much more smaller price that he's giving. Hines said that silver should be viewed as an inflation hedge next year, but added many traders don't see it that way. Its industrial uses as an electronic sector are relatively closely linked to some of the drivers of inflation that we're seeing at the moment. It has its place as an inflation-protected portfolio, but I don't see investors generally view it that way. It is deserved to have its spot on that, he said. Silver is a quintessential inflationary metal, said Goring and Rosenhoff Associates Manager Partner Lee Goring. The quintessential inflationary metal. That's an interesting description for this metal here, silver. I do think that silver should be accumulated by everyone, and I'm convinced that in this bull market there's going to be another corner attempted in the silver market. It's hard to believe that in January of 1980, on a very brief basis, the gold to silver ratio was 17-1. Wow. I wouldn't be surprised if we see that ratio again at some point in the bull market. Now, that's a pretty bold prediction. I don't see that happening. We can't recreate what happened in 1980. We can't. The silver market is much more complex these days. But regardless, longer term, Goring does not rule out silver climbing to over $500 in this decade. Silver plays massive catch-up rally to gold, and if gold gets to $10,000 in this decade and the gold to silver ratio gets down to 20-1, that's $500 silver. So there's going to be somebody in here that's going to have a crazy prediction like this. I don't see that happening in this decade. But, when you do something that's 7-8 years out, or 8 or 9 years out, anybody could say that anything could happen within that period of time. But I kind of doubt it's going to get to that scenario, and I don't think we're going to see 20-1 gold to silver ratio anytime soon, if ever. But we'll see. So there you have it. I hope you enjoyed this video and this prognostication for how silver, the scenarios where silver could outperform gold in 2022. Overall, I think I agree with much of the sentiment, but it doesn't sound like, aside from the one example I just gave, that anybody is going to be predicting that silver is going to go to the moon next year. There you have it. I'd like to extend a multitude of gratitude to you all for taking the time to watch, and to encourage you to please rate, share, comment, and subscribe.